Act 6 is about the aftermath of Maastricht, and it takes us up to the signature of the Lisbon Treaty in 2007. And in many ways, for integrationists, it's a rather disappointing period. As a condition of the single currency, the Germans had been very clear that countries wanting to join had to respect quite tight financial disciplines. And in particular, they had to keep their public sector deficits down to an absolute maximum of 3% of gross domestic product, had to keep inflation down, had to keep the level of public debt down. All of these things, policies that the Bundesbank had been pursuing for the Deutschmark for decades now, and that the Germans were determined not to lose when they surrendered their own currency. The problem was that the imposition of these financial disciplines in other member states wasn't always terribly popular. In a word, they tended to identify the European project with austerity, and perhaps not surprisingly, the popularity of the project tended to fall away in the course of the 1990s. Indeed, the French themselves, in the course of a referendum on the Treaty of Maastricht in September 1992, had only accepted the treaty by an absolutely wafer-thin majority. So that just at the moment when the European integrationists were thinking the floodgates have opened, and that the nation state is going to be hollowed out in favour of Europe and in favour of the regions, another feature of the Maastricht Treaty. In practice, the tide was already beginning to turn. And we can see this in the next treaty, the Amsterdam Treaty, which was a relatively minor consolidating treaty, and not really of the sort of dimensions that European enthusiasts wanted to see. Perhaps a key feature of the Amsterdam Treaty, 1997, was to codify a bit more the rights of European citizens, the rights notably to live and work in other member states, but also to vote in European and local elections if they're legally established in another European member state, and within certain limits to receive health care. European citizenship, it was always emphasised, was an add-on to national citizenship rather than a substitute for it, but it did contain certain significant new rights for every citizen of the new European Union, as it became called after the Treaty of Maastricht. But still, by and large, Amsterdam is relatively unambitious. So is the Treaty of Nice 2000, which is mostly concerned with adjusting the voting weights of different member states with a view to the next enlargement. The next enlargement? Oh yes. In 1995, the first post-end of Cold War enlargement, the EU is increased to 15 member states. We now have the original 6, plus Britain and Ireland and Denmark from 1973, plus Greece in 1980 and Spain and Portugal in 1986, and now the formerly neutral Scandinavian and Central European countries, Spain, Finland, Austria, come in. This is a fairly easy enlargement. They're all quite prosperous countries, and they're not really very difficult to integrate. Altogether more challenging, however, is the enlargement at the very beginning of the 21st century, 2004 to be precise, which is the first real post-Cold War enlargement, because it includes 3 former Soviet republics, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania. It includes the so-called Visegrad group of Central European countries, Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia and Hungary. It includes one former Yugoslav republic, Slovenia, and it includes two Mediterranean islands, Malta and Cyprus, or the part of it that isn't ruled by a pro-Turkish government. 10 more member states. It's quite an ambitious project in terms of population, but also in terms of the relative backwardness of many of these former Eastern Bloc countries, whose economies are still in a fairly rocky state even at the beginning of the 21st century. The immediate problem of sorting out voting weights is covered by the Nice Treaty of 2000, in advance of the big enlargement. But there's also a sense at the outset of the 21st century that maybe Europe should try and define its own end state. Rather than lurching from one treaty to the next, maybe it should actually try and say what it was about. What are the things that it's going to deal with, and what are the things that it isn't? And this notion found expression in the project of a European constitution, first outlined by various European statesmen, including German Foreign Minister Joschka Fischer, French President Jacques Chirac, in very different ways, finally taken up by a so-called Convention on the Future of Europe, chaired by Valéry Giscard d'Estaing from 2003 onwards, and set out in what was termed a European Constitutional Treaty in 2004. In some ways, the Constitutional Treaty was a sort of codifying exercise. It incorporated the existing Treaty of Rome, Single European Act, Maastricht Treaty and so on within its purview, and it also clarified and simplified a little bit the institutions. The representative for the common foreign and security policy was briefly dubbed a European Foreign Minister. The flag was set out as part of the Constitutional Treaty. The principle of qualified majority voting was adjusted so that it became not a formula of a fixed number of votes for each member state, but simply a proposal is carried by the Council of Ministers if it's voted by at least 55% of the member states, representing at least 65% of the population, and so on. And it was first President Chirac of France who decided that this treaty was important enough for his country to vote on it in a referendum, and he duly called a referendum in 2005, and this time the result went against the treaty. The Dutch had also done the same a week or so later, again voted massively against the Constitutional Treaty. So this was a real setback. This was a treaty that had been in the making for several years, and by the summer of 2005 it's dead in the water. The French and the Germans in particular managed to salvage it in the form of the Lisbon Treaty, which simply includes the new institutional provisions of the Constitutional Treaty almost unaltered, leaves the economic stuff in the form of the existing treaties, scales down some of the symbolism, notably that of the European Foreign Minister, and leaves it at that. And the Lisbon Treaty is passed by Parliament, no referendums here, in 2007. Some people see it as a rather sneaky sort of backdoor way of getting a European constitution onto the statute books, but after all it was agreed by heads of government and heads of state, and it was ratified by every European Parliament. That's 2007. And 2007, of course, is the first of the crisis years which take us to our final act.